All right, good to see everybody this morning. We've got two new sheets coming out this morning. It's for chapter 6 coming up, so you're going to have one page of just the text for chapter 6 with some area for notes, and then you'll have discussion questions on the second page for chapter 6. That means we are in chapter 5 of Daniel today. If you want to go ahead and be turning your Bible to Daniel, the 5th chapter, we have a very interesting chapter coming up. The handwriting is on the wall in this chapter. Daniel chapter 5. If you're ever missing a week of the notes, there's a little shelving unit on the back by the window that looks through to the hallway back there. And any leftover notes that are there for longer than a week, we just stack them in those shelving units. So if you're missing a chapter, there should be extra notes in that. If, for example, you're missing chapter 4 or chapter 5 today, there should be some extras in the back. And if you're looking and you can't find it, let me know, and I can always just print it off of the computer, and we can fix that real quick if you need notes, extra notes. So today you need chapter 5 notes, but you're getting chapter 6 to take home, and of course that's a very familiar chapter. Chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den, and we all know the story, but we're going to dig in and see if we can learn a little bit more in some of the lessons we learned. But today we have a very interesting chapter in Daniel chapter 5.
When you go back to chapter, I read that in 90% of chapter 4, the words of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes, it's him speaking.
And I thought, it was obviously something he put out to all people, so
Yes.
Daniel would have had it.
Yeah,
Daniel's still the writer, I understand that.
Sure.
He was writing what Nebuchadnezzar had obviously put out to all the people.
yeah. These are proclamations he was making, statements he was making in chapter 4. Yeah, it changes your perspective a little bit when you look at it from that perspective. These are the things he says. You get to see that transition in his thought over the course of the chapter. Interesting.
At the very end of the chapter, where was he? What was his condition?
I know.
What was his relationship with the Lord at the end?
I'm interested in that.
I don't know.
I don't know. I really don't know.
Wondered something too, reading through chapter 5. I wonder if this was the beginning of that phrase, the handwriting on the wall. We say that
Sure.
a lot.
Where would it have come from except from here? I don't.
Was this the original handwriting on the wall?
Yeah. I don't know of another occasion when a hand wrote on a wall. As several were saying, I've heard it over the course of the last couple of days, that some who couldn't be present on Wednesday for the funeral saw it live streamed. And if you have a moment and you can talk to the guys in the audio booth, let Josh and those folks know they do such a good job. They make available so much content that could not be otherwise accessible, and I'm glad we have the ability to do that. I'm glad that people can see things via live stream, and Josh did a great job getting that out, and the guys that work in the sound booth back there did such a good job. So be sure to thank those guys. They do a lot that goes unnoticed, and all that material that you have access to through Facebook and YouTube and the internet, that's their work, and they do an excellent job with that. if you want to add to your prayer list, we've been advertising the Lads to Leaders convention is coming up. We've got quite a few kids who are planning to attend that, and if you'll add to your prayer list the kids, I'm sure they would appreciate that. That they'll enjoy themselves. This is new for a lot of the kids going up there. We hope they have a good time and enjoy being around other Christian children from Christian homes, members of the church and such. But some of our boys are going to be leading songs in front of other people and reading some scriptures, and some of our girls will be in the special girls classes doing the same thing. So pray for them that they'll do a good job and enjoy themselves, and they'll be more invigorated to come back and do that again. Okay, let's get into chapter 5. Chapter 5. So we're going to follow our notes just like we normally do, and I think we just have a few, but it's going to get us through the bulk of the chapter today. So here's the first question. Question number 1. When chapter 5 opens, there are obviously some historical changes brought to our attention. Okay? Between these first few verses and what we learn at the end of the chapter, here's our first real question. What's happening historically? What can we figure out what's going on historically? Who is Belshazzar? Because this is, in Daniel, it's the first time we've had introduction to Belshazzar. What do you think is the significance of their drinking from the vessels of the temple? Why did they do that? Was there anything to that? And do you think it's possible today for people to make a mockery of spiritually significant things? And that's our application. And if so, how do we do that? And so let's just take the first part of that. Did you notice as we started reading chapter 5 that do you feel like are we still in the same setting, or have we shifted historically? Where are we at? What's going on? Did you have any thoughts on that about what's happening historically? Because when you open it up, there's Belshazzar. Is that the same thing as Nebuchadnezzar, or is this a different guy? Different guy. Yeah, Joel, you had your hand up.
No, that's what I was going to say. For some reason, we don't know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
You know,
He's out of the picture at this
he's out
point.
of the picture, and all of a sudden you open with Belshazzar, the king. We do know it was Nebuchadnezzar's son.
Right.
But what happened? We
Yeah.
don't know.
Okay. So there's a little bit of history that's happened between Nebuchadnezzar and now. And so what we want to try to do is take the pieces of the puzzle and sort of put them together to get a full picture of what's going on historically, because it matters because of what's happening at the end of the chapter. If you read this first part and you read the end of the chapter, what's going on outside the city walls? Did you get sort of a glimpse of what's happening? What was it? Yeah, they're about to be toppled by the Medo-Persian government, and so they're very near losing the Babylonian Empire. So there's a lot that's been going on historically. So if we look at chapter 5, look at verse 2, and the Bible says, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and the silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem. Do you happen to have any kind of superscription or a footnote for the word father? Anybody have that? What do you have, Mr. Bob?
Well, it wasn't his father.
Right.
His father was
Nabonidus.
a couple back, I mean.
Yes. Yes.
So we've skipped quite a bit.
Yes, we have. We've come through history quite a bit. So Bob was right. We've come through history quite a bit. Do you have an alternate translation for the word father? Ancestor. What is that? Or predecessor? Yeah, predecessor, ancestor. So in a sense, like if you're part of a royal line, right, you could be the son of somebody, just like when you read the genealogical accounts in the Bible, somebody could be the son of and the son of and the son of, and in a sense we're all sons of Adam in that sense. But the word here is probably better translated predecessor or ancestor, because as Bob mentioned, we've come down through history quite a bit, and Nebuchadnezzar's long out of the picture by this point. So let's figure out what's going on. So what we know is that historically, Nebuchadnezzar probably dies around the year 562 BC. Okay? So if you think about when we started the book, we talked about the invasions, right? So you have an invasion in 605, 596, and 586, and the one in 586 is what Jerusalem is just done in 586. But Nebuchadnezzar was reigning in 606. So he has about a 40-year stint that he reigns in Babylon, and he is taken out of the picture. He is succeeded by his son, Evil Marduk. That's his son, Evil Marduk, or Amel Marduk. And he only ruled for about 2 to 3 years. Evil Marduk did, and he was then assassinated by his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law kills Evil Marduk and assumes power, and his brother-in-law's name was Nergal-Shazer. And that's important because, hold your place in Daniel chapter 5, and go back with me a few pages to Jeremiah chapter 39. Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 39. So Nebuchadnezzar dies. He's replaced by his son, Evil Marduk. And Evil Marduk is murdered by his brother-in-law, Nergal-Shazer, or Sherezer. And drop down in Jeremiah 31, look at verse 3. Then all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle of the gate. And they're listed here, all these princes. And if you'll go down to the very first one, you see his name, don't you? Nergal-Shazer. Okay, that's who he is. He's the brother-in-law that killed Evil Marduk and assumed his reign. And he gets to reign, historically, he reigns for about 4 years before he dies, and he left his throne to his son, Labishi Marduk. But he was deposed about 9 months later. Labishi Marduk was disposed about 9 months later and replaced by a fellow by the name of Nabonidus. And Nabonidus, interestingly, came from the priestly side of the Babylonians, and he rules from about 556 to about 539 BC. And his son is a guy by the name of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus, and history confirms, if you look at historically what happens in the records, the annals of that period, that he had a co-regency with his father. So Nabonidus is actually still alive at this time, but Belshazzar is co-reigning with his father. And here's what that reference tells us, because we know that historically in 538 BC, the Medo-Persians allowed the Jews to go back into Jerusalem. They allow the Israelites to go back into, and you remember, you have all these important folks, like you've got Nehemiah, and you've got all these important prophets that are at work at that time that go back and start rebuilding Jerusalem. Well, that's 1 year from this period. So you've got Nabonidus and you've got Belshazzar. So we know that we're at the end of the Babylonian period, and they're about to be surpassed by the Medo-Persians. And it also tells us something about Daniel. Daniel is not a young guy anymore. So if you add this up, if you go from the time that he goes into Babylon, and if we think that he goes in 605 BC, and you get all the way down to 539 or 538 BC, we've actually, and Bob was just saying this, we've actually covered in the book of Daniel about 67 years of history between Nebuchadnezzar at the very beginning and Belshazzar here in chapter 5. And if he was a teenager when he went in, if you add 16 or 17-year-old teenager to the 67 years of history that have passed, you're talking about an 83, 84-year-old man at this point. Daniel's not a young guy anymore. He's an older man at this point. And so we would probably put Daniel in his 80s as this chapter opens. Okay? So now you're dealing with an entirely different guy than Nebuchadnezzar. So that ought to help us with the history just a little bit. So let's go back to the text now. Here's the second part of that first number one question, which is, what's going on with these elements from the temple? And let's read verse 2 and verse 3. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and the silver vessels which his father or predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, verse 4, they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron and wood and stone, And then that's when we're going to get to verse 5 about the handwriting on the wall. Why in the world did they do this? What was the significance of those vessels from the temple, if any? Yes, Art? Yes.
We don't care about you.
Yes.
We don't care about that history.
Yeah.
We don't care about all this.
I believe that's exactly right. It's not like they didn't have drinking vessels. It wasn't as though they just had them laying around and they thought these are convenient things to drink out of. He specifically requested these, and I think Art's exactly right. I think this was intentional to show how vehemently they hated the religion of people like Daniel and others who were still around.
I think you used the correct word earlier when you said mocking.
Yes, they were mocking. They were just, they were committing sacrilege. They were just mocking spiritual things. This was an open act of defiance, an act of sacrilege. It's a declaration of his and their contempt for God and his people. And by the way, you can't miss this principle, can you? You read verse 2 and verse 3, and it even says it again in verse 4, they drank wine. It's hard to miss that, the Bible says wine is a mocker and strong drink is a raging, and whoever thinks that he can control it is a fool. Proverbs 20, verses 1 and following. There's something to be said about the ability of alcohol to lower the inhibitions of people and make really stupid decisions. And this is just a great example of that, because in history you see that. We see it every day, right? People doing really dumb things because they've been fueled by alcohol to do that. So this is a great passage to kind of go along with the ability of intoxicating beverages to rob people of common sense and discernment. But they're showing open contempt for the things of God. Now I know that we don't have elements because we don't have a physical temple today, right? Do you think it's still possible for people to take things that are holy and do the same thing and show contempt for those things today? Give me an example of how that would happen today. Can you think of one? What is it?
Marriage.
Okay. Taking something that's honorable, like marriage. Marriage is honorable and all in the bed undefiled. But people do make a mockery of that. We've seen that. A lot of news stories within the last couple of 2 to 3 days have been in that regard about the erasing of those values that God put in the Bible. What about, what else? Yes, acts of worship can become that. Do you think it's possible to take something beautiful like praying and turn praying into an act of contempt and just mock things spiritually?
I heard while I was in college, I remember hearing a guy who got up, a young guy, college kid, thought he'd be cool. He got out and started talking in his prayer to God. Hey, Dad, I thought you were very disrespectful.
Yes.
Like that. I was really pleased and pretty impressed with the fact that one of the elders got up immediately following that
Yes.
prayer. So we don't pray to God this way.
Yeah.
And rebuked the boy right there in front of everybody. But that was a mockery, I thought.
It is, and I think there's potential to take anything that is holy and sacred and turn it into something that it's not meant to be. It's easy to show contempt for something if we're not really careful. I mean, Nadab and Abihu were great examples of that. They took strange fire and offered it before the Lord. Remember, we did a lesson not too long ago on that, and God said, "I will be regarded as holy. You will honor me." So we have to be really careful that we're not mocking the things that God has given us. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? Yes, Brother Bob.
The Lord's Supper.
The Lord's Supper could be.
Warned about that,
Yeah.
not partaking of it in the right manner.
If we don't partake of it in a way that is meant to be, according to 1 Corinthians 11, we bring judgment and condemnation upon ourselves. And then I know of some congregations who've taken the Lord's Supper and it's no longer a remembrance of the Lord's death. It's become just a performance, right? There's like drama and play acting involved in the Lord's Supper, and it can be that way. I know of a man who said he was visiting a congregation. Well, a couple of examples of that. A man was visiting a congregation, and they got ready to take the Lord's Supper, and somebody had dressed up in old robes and was carrying a big old wooden cross down, and just he said everybody was just totally fixed on that they were so distracted away from the Lord's Supper. And then another guy went to a congregation, I think it was in Ohio somewhere, and they sat down and noticed that people had their dogs with them, and they were feeding their dogs the Lord's Supper. And it was just making a mockery of that. We have to be really careful that we don't do what Belshazzar did here, which is to take things or principles that are holy and turn them into something else. Steve?
You notice the difference between verse 2 and 3. Verse 2, he asked for the gold or silver.
Yes.
And verse 3, he just asked for the gold.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to looking, and the only silver stuff I could find was that one of Joseph that he planted in Benjamin's.
Yeah. It could have been it. I don't know how long that endured, but that would be interesting if it was.
There was never mention of having silver.
Right.
Silver.
Everything was gold inlaid in the temple. Yeah. Very well could be. I'm not really sure. That's a good point, though. Yes.
On Highway 28 leaving Dunlap, there is a building, and its name is the Cup Barrier. That's all you see. It's on a big sign out front of the building. Never seen anyone there. Don't know how they work it.
I don't know.
I just see the sign that says Cup Barrier.
I don't know. I have to check into that and see what that is. That'd be interesting to know what that is. Okay, so here's question number 2. Question number 2. And this is, I have to tell you this real quick. Sometimes for a Bible story at night, sometimes the girls will say, tell us what you're going to talk about on Wednesday, or tell us what you're going to do Sunday. And so this is a couple of nights ago, Evie Rose goes, so what are you going to talk about Sunday? I said, well, it's a story from Daniel, and talking about a hand writing on the wall is probably not a story you want to tell right before bed. They were scared after this story. They were like, they kept looking on the wall, and I said, there's no hand on the wall. But they said, what if a hand is on the wall? And I said, there's no hand on the wall. So probably not a good story to tell before bedtime. But obviously it scared Belshazzar too. So here's question number 2. The worry of the king and the wise men's inability to interpret the handwriting on the wall all remind us of some of the earlier stories by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so there's a challenge to interpret what's going on and explain that. Why do you think they had to be reminded of Daniel? And, because he was still alive. He's still part of the wise men, part of the royalty in Babylon. I mean, he's still part of that. And wouldn't the aid he offered to Nebuchadnezzar be remembered? Were there not records of that? And how could they so soon forget about that? So what did you get in this next section? If you want to talk about, first of all, the hand and what that was, what did you get out of this next section, beginning in verse 5? First of all, let's just talk about the hand itself. Look at verse 5. In the same hour, now this is in the same hour that he's committing actions of contempt using the vessels of the temple, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And of course, verse 6, his countenance was changed. His thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. And the king cried, he screamed aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed purple, and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. And all the wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then the king, Belshazzar, was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. What do you think about that when you're reading that? Do you think that'd grab your attention if you're in the middle of a party and all of a sudden you see a hand writing on a wall? It would do it. I think that would do the job. In verse 5 it says, obviously the fingers of a man's hands, he sees that part of the hand that's writing. And the thing is, there's no man attached to it. It's just the hand. And it's writing on this big plaster wall. From what we know, if this is the traditional palace in Babylon, we know that based on some measurements by some historians who wrote about it, the wall itself, according to historians, was a really grand wall. It was about 50 feet high by about 160 feet long, and it was sealed with white plaster. So it was sort of, and they had a big candelabra, according to historians, so it was illuminated by this, and the white plaster just sort of reflected back. So it was like a big screen on the wall, and much larger than what we would have here, and it was the most distinct thing in the room, and this hand etched a message into the white plaster on the wall, and his appearance was immediately changed. He might have been drunk before, but this was an immediately sobering effect it had on King Belshazzar because he felt terror. And I'm always curious about this in verse 6 when it says, the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. What does that mean? Does it mean his hip actually came out of joint? Or how would you explain that? Have you ever felt that where you get startled all of a sudden and you feel like you just get loose, right? If you don't fall, at least it feels like you could fall. And the fact that your knees are knocking, it just feels like every joint in your body is just like out of place and moving. And he felt that way because this scared him so badly. So in verse 7, he screams for the wise men. He cried aloud. He's screaming out loud for these wise men. And according to verse 8, they're coming in. The idea of the language is, the verb language here is, they just come in one continual steady stream. It's one right after another coming in, and none of them can do this. So it reminds us of earlier stories in, you've got chapter 4, and then especially chapter 2, where you've got these wise men trying to interpret something, a divine message from God, and they just can't do it. And then verse 10 says, the queen. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall, and the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Don't let your thoughts be troubled. Don't let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. In the days of your father, your ancestor, your predecessor, light and understanding wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, that is your predecessor, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now, I do not know for sure, but who do you think this queen is? Is she the wife of Belshazzar or perhaps another lady?
Some commentaries say it's Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, and most historians believe this was probably the surviving wife of Nebuchadnezzar. And if that's true, would she have seen firsthand the actions of Daniel? Yes. And she would have lived through this. Now, she's been through all these changes in kings, but a lot of people say this is the queen mother here. Or if not, then maybe the wife of Nabonidus, his father, because he's something of a playboy. You get a sense that he's sort of a carefree playboy type guy. But a lot of folks believe this is the queen mother and likely the wife of the widow of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know that, but whoever she is, she has intimate knowledge of Daniel's ability to interpret the dreams. And so she reminds the king of her interactions with Daniel, of what she saw perhaps in her lifetime, if this is who that is. And she reminds him of Daniel as if she knows who Daniel is, like personal knowledge of Daniel from all these years. I don't know. The question is, why didn't he know about this? Did you have a theory or an opinion on that? I mean, I don't know for sure why, but it seems odd now, given his interactions with Nebuchadnezzar at least twice, and the accuracy with which he interpreted the dreams in chapter 2 and in chapter 4, these things all would have been recorded. So why didn't he know this? Why didn't Belshazzar know these things? Do you have an opinion on that, Art?
We often forget people who move out of power. It's maybe a crazy example, but I remember when Kissinger was an advisor to the president.
Yes.
I thought he was a brilliant man, but that president moves on and Kissinger falls out of the
Yeah.
he might still be a good advisor.
Right.
But he drops out. Look at the folks who have been a good Secretary of State, for instance.
Sure.
And administrations
Change, and then you
don't hear about them anymore.
Yeah, so in the book of Daniel, I think that's a great point. He likely had interactions with evil Marduk or Nergal-Shazer because he was still part of that court of advisors, but we have no record of that. So we have no record of the history of that. And so it could be that in administration changes, that while he was still part of that court, he just didn't have the prominence that he did in his interactions with Nebuchadnezzar. Tom?
The story of Joseph, there arose a Pharaoh.
Didn't know him.
Knew not Joseph.
Yeah.
And it hadn't been that long.
Yeah. And how could he not know? Because literally Joseph saved Egypt. So I think that could be a similar situation. It's not as though the history wasn't there. He just it was unconcerned with it, perhaps. So maybe either one of those could be. You get a sense in drinking as he's drinking the wine out of the things of the temple. What was his feeling toward the people of God? He had contempt for them. And so if Daniel comes from a group of slave boys taken out of Judea, I mean, he's out of Palestine, while he might have been on the royal court, Belshazzar probably didn't think a whole lot of him. Just kind of disregarded that. Maybe there were stories about Daniel, this royal advisor, but he kind of dismissed them because he obviously hated the vessels of the temple and the God who stood behind it, so he must have hated the people. And years have passed, and I think Art's right, and what Tom was saying too, sometimes in the passage of years when things, go by, that people forget over time. So I'm not exactly sure. Either way, he is reminded. I think this is a great lesson, though, in what the queen does. And I have to be reminded of this because all of us probably, well, some people more than others, if there's a problem, you want to be always the person to fix the problem, right? Especially if you have that personality to do it. If you're a personality type that's a defender and that's what you are, you can't help it. It's just how you're wired to do. But obviously none of these people could do it. And the queen herself could not do the job. So what does she do? She recommends the person who can do the job. I think that's such a good lesson. If you can't do the job, recommend somebody that can do the job. And I always think of this in terms of evangelism. There are a lot of people who are really nervous about talking to other people regarding Scripture. If you can't do the job, what should you be doing? Find somebody that can do the job, right? You want your aunt or your uncle or your mom or dad or brother or sister or daughter or son, you want them to go to heaven, and you're like, I wish I could explain this, but I can't do it. Then find somebody that can do that. Find somebody who can do that. I think what she did was very wise. She knew the dream or this handwriting needed to be interpreted. She couldn't do it, but she recommends the person who can do it. So there's no harm in recommending people who are more capable than ourselves to do something when it's something so important. So, number 3, according to Daniel, what was the catalyst for all of this? And we won't be able to read it all, but if you start in verse 12 and you read all the way down through verse 22 and 23, what prompted all of this? Especially when you get to verse 22. If you want to jump ahead, and you look at verse 22 especially, what was the catalyst for all this? What was God's motive for doing this on the wall? Doesn't recognize him, and according to verse 22, what was the condition of his heart? Oh, boy, he was lifted up in pride, and this seems so very much like what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, if you pre-read this over the week, then you know that before he ever gets to talking about Belshazzar's heart, what was the historical example he gives them? What did he remind him of? Let me tell you about Nebuchadnezzar. And he told him about how Nebuchadnezzar was lifted up in pride, and God brought down Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, you need to humble your heart. You need to do that, or you're going to end up in the same condition. Look at verse 22. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. You knew it. So there must have been some knowledge of what happened to his predecessor, but he just refused that and charted the same course. Verse 23, you've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. They brought the vessels of his house before you, you and your lords, your wives and your concubines. You've drunk wine from them. And you praise the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. And so that's the catalyst for everything that is going on in this passage, because he's reminding the king that God's always been in control, even giving Nebuchadnezzar his success, worldwide power, and taking it away because of his pride. And Nebuchadnezzar was lifted up, and God brought him down, and he reminds him of the same thing. And to me, I underline this in my Bible. I mean, you could underline ultimately everything because it's all important, but this just stood out. I just think this is a great reminder. Look at verse 23. God, who holds your breath in his hand, under whose control is your life? God's. You think you own your life? Right? You might be a morally responsible person, but that's the point. You're morally responsible to God. And you can be a pagan king in some distant land, and you're still responsible to God because He holds your breath in His hand. That's such a powerful statement. God holds your breath in His hand. You think you can just remove yourself from God? He owns all your ways. That's powerful language. And you have not glorified Him. It means that every single person in this world has a responsibility to glorify God. There's accountability for everybody. So, Daniel finally gets to the handwriting on the wall. And so on the wall, this hand has written, many, many tekel upharsin. And you see that down in verse 25, the inscription was written, many, many tekel upharsin. And verse 26, by the way, if you ask the girls, that's their favorite part of the story. They think that's really cool to say many, many tekel upharsin. They've been saying it to people in school, and people at school are like, what in the world are you talking about? They just think that's the coolest thing. So ask Graceley this morning what many, many tekel upharsin is. She'll tell you what it means. So we get an explanation of it. We actually have the interpretation of it. Verse 26, many. It means God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, which is a derivative of upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. What's the message on the wall? What's he telling Belshazzar? You're done. It's over with. You're done. Babylon's coming to an end. You're done. Your ancestors, you've all lifted your heart up in pride, and God's saying, I'm done with y'all. And so it's coming to an end. He even tells him in verse 28, the Medes and the Persians are going to take over your kingdom. And this would be a vivid reminder because historically, they're sitting right outside the city. The city's surrounded at this point. And if you do some research historically, read some of the historians as they talk about this, because they will record that Babylon, the great city of Babylon, and Babylon fell on a night in which there was a great party taking place in the city. And that's exactly what we're reading about. So historically, it confirms everything that's going on here. And when he does this, oddly enough, verse 29, Belshazzar gave the command, clothed Daniel with purple, and put a chain of gold around his neck, made a proclamation concerning him, and that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. So he gets promoted on that night. But look at verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And really, verse 31, most people think verse 31 is probably the beginning of the thoughts of chapter 6 about Darius the Mede and Daniel's place. It's interesting because we don't know a whole lot more from Scripture about what happens in verse 30 when it says he was slain, but we do know that it was recorded in history that Cyrus sieged the city, because you have Cyrus and Darius, those two men, Medo-Persians. They sieged the city, and the Babylonians advanced, and they drove them back into the city. So they were basically shut up inside the city. And the most amazing thing is, Cyrus was able somehow to divert the water from the Euphrates River. He put a dam up and just diverted the river, and the river just dried up in the bed, and they walked right through the dry riverbed into the city of Babylon and overtook the city on the same night which the party was taking. But this is an amazing chapter where God basically says to Belshazzar and the Babylonian kingdom, it's over with. You're done. I'm done with you. And maybe we should remind ourselves that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall, because that's really what this chapter is about. Okay, chapter 6. Daniel's an old guy in a different kingdom, and yet he's still hated by people, and they're still trying to catch him up in some trick so that he can be destroyed, and he gets caught because he's faithful in prayer and faithful to his God. He gets thrown in a lion's den. We're going to talk about that beginning the week after next. So I've got a meeting next week, so you'll have some guest speakers and some of the men from the congregation helping out to fill in next Sunday beginning, because I've got a meeting starting in Dalton at the Riverbend congregation next week. But you got 2 weeks to get ready for Daniel chapter 6. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.